Hegel attempts to outline the fundamental nature and conditions of human knowledge in these first 3 chapters. He asserts that the mind does not immediately grasp the objects in the world, concurring with Kant, who said that knowledge is not knowledge of things in themselves, or of pure inputs from the senses. A long-standing debate raged in philosophy between those who believed that matter was the most important part of knowledge and those who privileged mind. Rationalists such as Descartes, and before him, Plato, believed that we can only trust the truths that the mind arrives at on its own, while empiricists, such as Locke, argued that all of our knowledge comes from our perceptions of actual objects, through our senses. Kant had sought to put this debate to rest by arguing that the meaning of objects derives from ideas, or concepts, that stand between mind and matter. The information entering the mind via the senses is always mediated by concepts. In the first part of the Phenomenology, Hegel demonstrates that though concepts do in fact mediate matter, as Kant maintains, Hegel's own understanding of the way concepts come into being implies a certain instability, or insecurity in knowledge, which Kant overlooks. Whereas Kant seems to imply that an individual's mind controls thought, Hegel argues that a collective component to knowledge also exists. In fact, according to Hegel, tension always exists between an individual's unique knowledge of things and the need for universal concepts, 2 movements that represent the first and second of the 3 so-called modes of consciousness. The first mode of consciousness, meaning, or sense certainty, is the mind's initial attempt to grasp the nature of a thing. This primary impulse runs up against the requirement that concepts have a universal quality, which means that different people must also be able to comprehend these concepts. This requirement leads to the second mode of consciousness, perception. With perception, consciousness, in its search for certainty, appeals to categories of thought worked out between individuals through some kind of communicative process at the level of common language. Expressed more simply, the ideas we have of the world around us are shaped by the language we speak, so that the names and meanings that other people have worked out before us, throughout the history of language, shape our perceptions. Consciousness is always pulled in 2 different directions. Our senses give us a certain kind of evidence about the world, and the categories through which we make sense of the world, categories that we learned when we learned language, tell us what the input of our senses means. The fact that a difference exists between perceptions and the meanings we give to them gives rise to a feeling of uncertainty, or skepticism, that is built into the very mechanism by which minds come to know objects. That is, to the extent that consciousness can grasp categories of thought, it is at the same time aware of the inadequacy of these categories and thus moved to find new ground for sense certainty, generating new concepts that smooth over the contradictions. This striving is constantly frustrated. The categories of thought reveal their inner contradictions, and consciousness is moved to posit more adequate categories. Although sense certainty is in some ways always elusive, this process of moving from less satisfactory to more satisfactory categories entails a kind learning process. Hegel calls this process understanding, the third and highest mode of consciousness. Analysis. For the unprepared lay reader, Phenomenology of Spirit, the earliest of Hegel's major, mature works, can be a frustrating introduction to his highly idiosyncratic and difficult philosophical style. The difficulty arises in part because Hegel, working within the tradition of German idealism, was attempting to grapple with dimensions of human experience that lie largely outside the scope of this tradition, which was established above all by Kant. While deeply indebted to Kant, Hegel did not find the language of idealism wholly adequate to explain what he felt needed explaining, and he had to invent his own philosophical terms, which at first seem unfamiliar and strange. The difficulty of phenomenology also lies in the work's extraordinary ambition. In one dizzying gesture, the 27-year-old Hegel attempts to outline and define all the diverse dimensions of human experience as he sees them: knowledge and perception, consciousness and subjectivity, social interaction, culture, history, morality, and religion. The result is chaotic, and his points are often difficult to grasp, but the work is ultimately highly rewarding for those with the right mix of patience and imagination required to decode Hegel. The spirit of man has broken with the old order of things, is the dramatic, but fitting statement with which Hegel introduces phenomenology of spirit. Here he sets out his agenda for a systematic philosophy, the subject of which is not simply the knowing and perceiving individual mind, as it was for his immediate philosophical heirs such as Kant, but social beings who are oriented to the world collectively through culture. The individual is not simply standing directly opposite objects, but rather is forced to mediate between the subjective and the collective moments of understanding, that is, between his own immediate perceptions and the ideas about the world that he shares with the people around him. In these early sections of Phenomenology of Spirit, we get an early glimpse of this approach, the famous dialectic, the idea that knowledge is a process of striving to arrive at stable and truthful categories of thought. Knowledge as motion is a recurrent theme in Hegel's writings and forms the core of his highly original approach to epistemology. Summary: Hegel moves from the discussion of consciousness in general to a discussion of self-consciousness. Like the idealist philosophers before him, Hegel believes that consciousness of objects necessarily implies some awareness of self as a subject, which is separate from the perceived object. But Hegel takes this idea of self-consciousness a step further and asserts that subjects are also objects to other subjects. Self-consciousness is thus the awareness of another's awareness of oneself. To put it another way, one becomes aware of oneself by seeing oneself through the eyes of another. Hegel speaks of the struggle for recognition implied in self-consciousness. This struggle is between two opposing tendencies arising in self-consciousness, between, on one hand, the moment when the self and the other come together, which makes self-consciousness possible, and on the other hand, the moment of difference arising when one is conscious of the otherness of other selves vis-à-vis oneself, and vice versa. Otherness and pure self-consciousness are mutually opposed moments in a life and death struggle for recognition. This tension between selves and others, between mutual identification and estrangement, plays out in the fields of social relations. Hegel explains that the realization of self-consciousness is really a struggle for recognition between two individuals bound to one another as unequal in a relationship of dependence. One person is the bondsman and one is the servant. The bondsman, or servant, is dependent on the Lord. Because he is aware that the Lord sees him as an object rather than as a subject, i.e., as a thing, rather than as a thinking, self-aware being, the Lord frustrates his desire to assert his pure self-consciousness. He is stuck in a position of reflecting on his otherness. The independent Lord, on the other end, is able to negate the otherness that he finds reflected through the subordinate bondsman, since the bondsman does not appear as a conscious subject to him. As the independent and superior partner in this relationship, his otherness does not bear down on him. The Lord occupies the position of enjoying his dominant status, whereas the bondsman must continuously reflect on his status as a subordinate other for the Lord. At the same time, the Lord does not find his position completely satisfying. In negating his own otherness in the consciousness of the bondsman, in turning the bondsman into an object unessential to his own self-consciousness, he has also to deny a fundamental impulse toward recognizing the bondsman as a consciousness equal to himself. At the same time, the bondsman is able to derive satisfaction in labor, a process of working on and transforming objects through which he rediscovers himself and can claim a mind of his own. Analysis. This section of the Phenomenology and for that matter the rest of the book, is difficult because of its abstractness. Hegel writes about lords and bondsmen, or masters and slaves, as it is sometimes translated, and it is hard at first to see whom he is talking about and whether this is meant to describe social relations today, or at some period in the past when slavery was more widespread. Precisely because it is so abstract, the section has been interpreted in many different ways. It is possible to view the lord and bondsman relationship as an early stage of history, since the phenomenology describes the evolution of spirit throughout the course of human civilization, culminating in modern society. However, the dialectical evolution of spirit throughout history may also be seen as a metaphor for the process through which each individual develops psychologically. Thus, the images of the lord and bondsman may be interpreted not literally, but as metaphors for positions in which we all find ourselves throughout life, sometimes as the objectified bondsman, sometimes as the objectifying lord. The lordship and bondage section is among the most widely cited in all of Hegel's writings. The struggle for recognition between lord and bondsman inspired Marx's account of how class struggle naturally arises from the exploitation of one social class by another. A diverse array of 20th century thinkers, including psychoanalysts and existentialists, have drawn on Hegel's ideas here. Earlier idealists, such as Kant, pointed out the difference between subject and object, but Hegel believed that the subject, or the self, is aware of itself only as a distinct entity through the eyes of another self. The radical idea inherent in this view is that consciousnesses are inextricably interwoven, and that one cannot have any concept of oneself without having actually experienced a moment of identification with the other. Many readers have found his notion of self-consciousness easier to grasp intuitively than many of Hegel's other concepts. His account seems to ring true with everyday experience. People come to know themselves through the image they suppose others hold of them. This image is positive or negative depending on who that person is, where he or she stands in society, and so forth, and gives rise to familiar stresses as individuals strive to assert their free individuality against the objectifying images that others have of them. Summary. At the end of chapter 4, Hegel describes the unhappy consciousness that arises from individuals having to struggle for recognition from one another to realize themselves as self-conscious subjects. He asserts that various religious institutions and philosophical systems serve as a refuge from the fear and objectification that arise in this struggle. By turning toward a transcendent being, God, one can take comfort in a being that exists purely for itself, rather than in a struggle for recognition between beings, and thus isolate oneself from that struggle. This turn toward a transcendent being follows from the initial attempt of consciousness to grasp the nature of the object. The striving for sense certainty leads to perception and to the social nature of universal concepts. Hegel's understanding of the dialectical movement of thought leads him to take issue with the idealist notion of reason. Reason is not, as the Kantian idealists claim, a matter of fitting isolated objects into universal categories. Reason involves a self-conscious ego struggling to assimilate objects while having to fend off their otherness, which it sees as a threat to its existence as a self-conscious being. Like Kant, Hegel believes that reason leads consciousness to fit particular phenomena into universal categories. However, this process is not smooth and always involves an element of uncertainty and vagueness, since objects exist in a fluid spectrum of variations, and do not readily conform to distinct universal categories. Thus, insofar as consciousness is oriented to those stable categories of thought, it is also aware of a set of standards governing how phenomena conform to such categories. These standards, or laws of thought, reside neither in the objects nor in the mind, but in a third dimension, in the organized social whole. When looking at the social dimension, we can see that every individual self-consciousness belongs to one collective self-consciousness, a locus of identity existing outside of every individual in the collective. Laws of thought, morality, and conventions belong to social life. Individual activities and interpretations conform to these laws as having a taken for granted existence, as matters at hand, and individuals see these common laws not as alien, but as emanating from their own selves, as a law of one's own heart. Hegel calls this dimension of collective consciousness spirit. Spirit is the location of the ethical order, the realm of the laws and customs, to which individual consciousnesses assent, but that exist outside of individuals in the social being. Individuals interpret and act out laws and customs in an individual way, but they do so in tension with this communal spirit. The ethical communal spirit has two manifestations. First, it is the basis of the deep-seated ethical orientation of individuals as an object of faith. Second, it has an outward existence as the culture and civilization of a given historical age. These two moments of ethical spirit, or ethical life, are in tension with each other. In modern Enlightenment culture, for example, the external cultural expression of ethical life, or spirit, is a kind of individualism. An emphasis on education and the acquisition of wealth actually orients consciousness away from the social being and the deep ethical life of which it is a part. In its most extreme negative form, individualism in the modern world finds expression in despotism and political terrorism. When political life is no longer a true expression of common ethical life, factions, merely pretending to represent the collective, will enforce their rule through terror and the annihilation of opposing factions. In its more positive guise, individualism finds expression in individual rights. The next stage in the development of consciousness is religion. Religion is essentially a collective spirit conscious of itself, and as such it reflects a given culture's expression of ethical life and the balance between individual and collective. There are different phases in the development of religion represented in the various world religions and reflected in art, myth, and drama. But religion is not the highest stage of consciousness. This place is reserved for absolute knowledge. Whereas with religion, spirit is conscious of itself in pictorial or poetic form, in the state of absolute knowledge, consciousness combines attention to subjective knowledge with attention to objective truth. That is, in absolute knowledge, spirit becomes aware of its limitations and seeks to correct its contradictions and inadequacies by moving to a higher plane of understanding. Absolute knowledge is self-conscious and critical engagement with reality. It is the standpoint of science and the starting point of philosophical investigation. Analysis. The religious connotations of the Hegelian term spirit have led many to believe that Hegel understands spirit as a kind of supernatural or divine force guiding human civilization and history. As noted, spirit is a translation of the German word Geist, which can also mean mind, and while spirit is reflected in religion, in itself it is actually something more like culture, or the collective mind of a social being. Ethical life is an expression of spirit in everyday reality. The ethical encompasses the common understandings, customs, and moral codes of a culture, a super-individual communal source of interpretation determining how people act, what they believe, and how they relate to the world and to the divine. Hegel says that even reason, which can be treated as abstract and universal, is deeply embedded in collective culture. One of Hegel's most original and influential ideas is that culture is a dynamic force and subject to change. While deeply influenced by Kant and German idealism, Hegel was also close to the Romantic movement that was strong in Germany when he came of age intellectually. German Romantic philosophers such as Hegel took issue with the image of the human experience that Kant and his students promoted. The Kantians and the rationalists of the Enlightenment sought to establish reason as a universal and unchanging bedrock of knowledge. The Romantics thought the Kantians did not fully appreciate the profound differences in human experience from age to age and culture to culture. Hegel came along to fuse the insights of both camps, and the resulting view sees the human mind striving for stable categories of thought and referencing the common interpretations and customs of society to do so. In other words, one approaches the world through a common mind. This common mind operates as a consciousness in and of itself, seeking to understand the world, bumping up against contradictions in the process, sorting through these contradictions, and moving forward. One gets a glimpse here of Hegel's view of history as the dynamic unfolding of the collective mind or spirit. Hegel begins by demonstrating that the categories of thought through which the mind grasps objects are not as stable or certain as his predecessor Kant seems to assume. This instability even applies to that apparently fundamental, universal category, being. To be able to say that something is, that it exists, implies another category, nothingness, or not being. Being always implies nothingness, and vice versa, such that one cannot call to mind one category without invoking the other. Being and nothingness are understood as both opposed and identical, a unity of being and nothing. Consciousness experiences this unity of opposites as contradiction, which it seeks to resolve by invoking a third category called becoming, which captures both nothing and being at once. This dialectical process is how thought moves, according to Hegel's model. Consciousness posits a basic category that engenders a contradiction, is negated, and falls apart, creating a need for a more complex category that smooths over the contradiction. This new composite category, in turn, reveals its own contradiction, and points to another category, and so on. Essence, the subject of Book 2, is a higher, more complex mode by which consciousness grasps objects. Consciousness of being tries to get at objects through the simple binary of being and not being, and through the outcome of the tension between these two categories, namely, becoming. Essence, on the other hand, points to qualities beyond mere existence or non-existence, to particular qualities of the object. These qualities manifest themselves in the appearances of objects. Instead of being or not being, objects appear to have different natures. Being and essence are both features of objective logic, that is, they pertain to qualities of objects themselves. Subjective logic, on the other hand, gets at ideal properties of knowledge, those emanating from products of the mind, namely, concepts or notions, which make up the third and highest level of consciousness. It is at the level of concepts that subjective and objective are considered together. This is the domain of philosophy or metaphysics, where the concern is the interrelation of consciousness and inputs from the world of material objectivity. Analysis. The phenomenology of spirit is regarded as Hegel's first shot at establishing his own unique philosophical approach. He covers a lot of ground and introduces many of the major themes that reappear in his later philosophical writings, but the work is very confusing. His Science of Logic, published in stages beginning in 1812, is no less difficult for the uninitiated, but it benefits from the 5 intervening years Hegel had to reflect carefully on his ideas. The latter book is widely understood to be a more systematic treatise on ontology, which is the study of being, and epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. Here Hegel explicitly lays out his famous dialectic, the concept that, along with the equally challenging concept of Geist, is most frequently associated with his name. The slogan, thesis antithesis synthesis, has long circulated as a useful shorthand for understanding the basic idea of Hegel's dialectical method. However, Hegel himself never uttered this construction, and most Hegel scholars agree that it is both helpful and potentially misleading. In The Science of Logic, Hegel sets out to show that the process by which consciousness assimilates objects into mental concepts is more dynamic, and one might say, messier than Kant describes it. Just as he does in the Phenomenology, Hegel traces here the movement of consciousness, or the idea, from basic categories to more complex ones. Consciousness attempts to grasp objects at a most basic level, finds this first attempt somehow unsatisfying as exposing inadequacies or contradictions, and proceeds to a higher level, and so on. In the Phenomenology and elsewhere, Hegel seems to imply that this dialectical unfolding is an inherent feature of the world we inhabit, governing history and culture. In logic we see that the dialectic is a phenomena of ideas. But the two dimensions of reality, i.e., history, culture, and the world in general, and our ideal, mental, or conceptual grasp of things are not really separable. The world we live in is a world created by ideas. But our ideas do not emanate from the mind of a single individual, as other idealists, such as Kant, seem to imply. Concepts have an objective status. They exist outside of any individual as taken for granted reality. They belong to common cultural understanding. The basis of individual rights lies in property. Property is not merely material acquisition. It is central to an individual's assertion of identity and personality. Property is an expression of self and the locus of an individual's claim to rights, since it is through property that one can say, "This is mine," a claim that others respect. Property is the embodiment of personality, says Hegel. The system of private property establishes individuality and personality through contract and exchange. Contract establishes ownership through institutionalized norms of mutual respect of individual rights and obligations. Economic life governed by free exchange of commodities is based on an institutionalized notion of the individual as having some claim to recognition as a right-bearing person. If an exchange market is to function efficiently, economic actors must recognize universal standards by which a person can claim to own property. Established norms of reciprocal recognition in the modern economic sphere are internalized in economic actors and represent a common will. The concept of individual rights, to which this common will gives its assent, is an abstract concept. The individual it implies is a universal individual without particular traits and without reference to social or cultural environment. Thus, rights established by private property and exchange are abstract rights and engage individuals as abstract, universal subjects. The system of mutual recognition, an abstract right, is the basis of what Hegel calls morality. Morality is essentially the subjective side of the reciprocal social obligations institutionalized in contracts and the economic market. Individuals experience such reciprocal obligations as a moral obligation to respect universal rights. Morality gestures toward what ought to be and frequently is not. It is an abstract ideal, a vision of good based on mutual recognition of rights. People are morally motivated through a sense of duty to defend the universal rights of individuals. Analysis. In Elements of a Philosophy of Right, Hegel attempts to fuse diverse elements of his philosophy and social thought into a grand statement about the nature of modernity. He traces a modern conception of individuality and of the individual as the bearer of rights to modern social, economic, and political institutions. He also describes how this modern notion of the individual, while positive in many ways, gives rise to certain stresses and to the alienation of the individual from the collective. In the first section, Abstract Right, Hegel returns to a theme of earlier writings in which he wrestles with the fairly common belief in natural rights that are present in the various social contract theories of, for example, John Locke, where social or political order is said to derive its legitimacy from its ability to uphold and protect the rights of autonomous, sovereign individuals. For Locke and others, the social is merely the outcome of a contract between autonomous individuals to respect each other's rights. In this view, the extent of one person's relationship to another can be summed up in the slogan, "Be a person and respect others as a person." Hegel believes this view of social life to be generally accurate, but he rejects the belief that contractual mutual recognition and the ideal of the universal rights-bearing individual it supports is a basis of all societies throughout history. The worldview implied in contract theory and in the moral obligation to respect individual rights is not the foundation of social life, but rather a reflection of the spirit of the modern age. This spirit resides in modern legal and economic institutions, which foster an idea of abstract rights and universal personhood. Hegel therefore applies his theory of history and culture to an analysis of the modern world. He also criticizes both contemporary political theory and idealist moral philosophy for not recognizing that the phenomena they recognize as universal laws are actually particular expressions of modern culture. The morality that we see expressed in contracts and exchanges, which reflect a reciprocal respect between individuals for one another's rights, is only a particular expression of a wider and deeper dimension of moral life that Hegel calls ethical life. Ethical life is a system of norms and mores belonging to a social body, made up of spheres of social interaction and interdependence, in which all individuals are embedded. Whereas morality turns people away from what is toward what ought to be, ethical life is merely what is, the set of meanings and practices that guide people in everyday activities whether they are aware of it or not. Ethical life is present in the three important levels of social life. In its most elementary form, it is present in the family and finds expression in basic emotions such as love and altruism. In civil society, a sphere of social interaction corresponds to economic life, or the system of needs. Civil society engages individuals as bearers of abstract rights, as owners of property, and bearers of legal rights. In civil society, individuals relate to one another in universal terms. While private property as the basis of abstract right and morality is a positive force in promoting individual freedom, individualistic material interests, such as the pursuit of economic gain, could potentially destabilize society. When left unchecked, these destabilizing forces tend to polarize humanity into rich and poor. The individualism of private material acquisition also weakens the expression of the basic social bonds and common culture that hold society together. Certain institutions must be in place to prevent the system of private property and the individualist worldview it sustains from undermining society itself. Government authority, in addition to providing basic infrastructure and protection from crime, must both promote and protect society from economic individualism, ensuring that those without property or work are provided for. Corporate institutions, such as guilds or labor unions, must be in place not just to look after the economic needs of workers and tradesmen, but to give them a sense of belonging and connection to the social whole of which they are a part. After the family and civil society, the third and highest moment of ethical life is the institution of the state. The state is the medium through which individuals come to realize their location in the ethical life of society as parts of a greater whole. The state is an expression of spirit unfolding in history through dialectical development. Whereas earlier forms of the state were imperfect expressions of collective spirit, The modern state has evolved as a rational adaptation to structures of modern life. Given the image of the universal person and the emergence of the autonomous rights-bearing individual, the modern state, as the highest form of collective association, serves to integrate this vision of individual freedom and autonomy into an appreciation of common social bonds, preventing these two opposed tendencies from pulling society apart and allowing freedom and rights to coexist with the full expression of communal spirit. Analysis. Philosophy of Right is Hegel's most controversial work, as many readers have objected to the central role he attributes to the state in realizing a reconciliation of modern individuality and freedom with the need for collective belonging. However, Hegel's model of the rational state, though by no means purely democratic, does not invest power in authority simply to suppress individuality. Hegel understands the state in terms that are somewhat unfamiliar to modern readers, who, in the wake of the totalitarian states that arose during the 20th century, tend to be skeptical of theories that give political institutions the task of solving society's problems. For Hegel, the state is not just a political and authoritarian entity, but the broadest arena of social relations corresponding to common culture, or ethical life. It is in the institution of the state, therefore, that the contradictions of ethical life will reveal and fix themselves. In modern society, the role of the state is to reconcile the egoistic and individualizing tendencies of civil society with the need for common belonging. Hegel largely adopts Kant's description of the moral, rational individual, but believes that Kant's understanding of individuality is an expression of a particular historical epoch, namely of the modern world. Hegel is thus regarded as one of the first philosophers of modernity and of a particularly modern understanding of history. If there is a unifying ambition throughout his vast writings, this ambition lies in his attempt to describe the origins and implications of this image of the individual and how it relates to the religious, economic, and political aspects of modern life. Here he shows how this notion of individuality is rooted in practical life, but also that it has a fundamental tension with the expression of ethical life.